Hi, Pastor. It's good to see you. It was really great this past week to talk to Pastor Freddie. So good to see him. So good to see his wife, Sandra. Glad to see that God is continuing to work even in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis. So I'm so grateful for that. I was also glad to hear that the videos and the notes were helping you. I'm so encouraged by Freddie's leadership and by all of you continuing to study and fellowship together. You know, ultimately, it's God working through all of us together that makes this a partnership and really makes a difference in our effectiveness to minister to people around us. So I just want to say thank you so much for continuing to be faithful. All of us here at Corbin long for the day that we can begin coming back again and be with you face to face. But until then, we're going to minister to you as best we can through these videos and at a distance. So today we come to the book of Joshua. We've talked about the first 5 books of the scripture already, the Pentateuch. We've talked about the story that was told in them as it began with the high of creation and dropped down to the fall, the promise of God to Abraham, and then the slavery of the children of Israel. Then God delivers them and builds them into a nation. And just when you think everything was right for them to move in and receive the promised land, they disobey and rebel against God and wander in the wilderness. But now, with the book of Joshua, we come to a high point in Israel's history, as we're going to see one of those periods in their history in which they are faithful to the Lord, in which they are obedient and they enjoy the success that God wanted to give them all along. And so when we come to the book of Joshua, what we find is the emphasis on the book that shows the conquering of the land of Israel. So you can see at the top of the mountain the conquest. So this is one of those mountain peaks in their history, a great time of success and rejoicing. Now let's take a little bit closer look at the book of Joshua. I think a good theme would be this: God enables Israel to conquer and divide the promised land. This land was promised to Israel through Abraham all the way back in Genesis, the very first book of Scripture. And we've watched the bumpy road that Israel has taken to this point, but now God is going to enable this second generation to go into the promised land and to take it. When we think about the individual components of the book opens with preparation for conquest. First of all, Joshua takes Moses' place. Now, I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment at the end of our video, but just put yourself in Joshua's sandals. God comes to Joshua and tells him, I want you to do what the greatest leader in all of Israel was unable to do: conquer the promised land. Joshua, I want you to lead your people in to take the land that all of their parents were too afraid to take. So God was working in the heart of Joshua to prepare him to lead the children of Israel into conquest. And then, of course, we see the conquest of the land. This section of the book is divided in 3 portions. We see them first take the center of the land, Jericho and Ai, and then we see the southern attacks from the armies, and then we see the northern attacks. Through these 3 campaigns, God gives the nation of Israel, through Joshua, the land that he had promised them. If you look closely at those conquests, at those campaigns, you'll notice something unique. God prepared the land, even in the way the battles were fought, for his children. So think about it. God had said in the book of Deuteronomy, when you go into a land and you eat crops that you didn't plant, and you live in houses that you didn't build, don't forget that those came from the Lord. Now, in a typical conquest, when one country would attack another, they would actually destroy the crops, and they would burn down the cities and completely ruin them. But in this case, other than Ai, Jericho, Hatzor, for most of the cities and most of the fields in the land of Israel, God preserved them. What he did instead is he drew the armies out of these cities. He drew the armies out of the northern coalition to come down and attack the nation of Israel. And he drew the armies out of the southern coalition to come up and to attack the nation of Israel. The result of that was, when the battle was over, the children of Israel were able to take cities that they had not destroyed. So indeed, they were able to live in houses they had not built, and they were able to harvest crops and eat food they had not planted. So in this conquest of the land, God was extraordinarily faithful and gracious to the children of Israel. The next portion of the book, we see how the land was divided. This was a fulfillment of God's promise that each of the tribes would receive a portion of the land. And so now we see the faithfulness of God as he gives them the land and it divides up. And each of them have a home now. The book ends with a series of events about beginning life in the land. You see the 2.5 tribes that dwelt on the other side of the Jordan. You see them return home. You see the monument built as a reminder of God's faithfulness. You see Joshua's final charge to the nation of Israel as he reminds them of God's faithfulness, God's victories, and then he challenges them to be true to God. As Joshua says, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And so Joshua prepares the people to live life in the land. So that gives us an overview of the conquest and the dividing of the land of Israel. But before we go out today, I want to talk about some themes. I want to suggest to you some good topics. As you meet together as pastors, here's 3 things that I think would be great conversations that come from the book of Joshua. Here's the first one. We see in the book of Joshua about changing leaders. Take a look at that first chapter of Joshua. Take a look at what God says to him. And take a look at how God moves leadership from Moses to Joshua. You know, for all of you, you serve both the role of Moses and the role of Joshua. As a part of being in this program, remember, you're mentoring people. You are raising up leaders as a part of being in this program, as a part of your ministry. In that way, you're Moses to a group of Joshuas. Take your study Bibles and look in the concordance and look up how many times Joshua was found, even before this book. In fact, I'd encourage you to look and see how far back do we first see Joshua. This is what we would learn. You're going to see that Joshua has walked with Moses a long time. The preparation for Joshua to lead this nation didn't just come in Joshua chapter 1. So talk about that time and that investment that Moses has made into Joshua. And look and discuss, look at those key major events that Joshua was a part of. All of those helped shape him as a leader. Also, many of you are also Joshuas. Someone is mentoring you. You are learning from someone. Or perhaps you are stepping into a new role that has been vacated. Perhaps a pastor has been very successful and they've retired or they've moved and now you're stepping into a new role. Or maybe you're young in ministry and you're just beginning to serve in your first church and so you feel like Joshua. So take a look at Joshua chapter 1 and take a look at the end of Deuteronomy where Moses and the Lord talked to Joshua and listen to those words. Think about how many times they challenged Joshua to not be afraid, but to recognize that God is going to be with him just like it was with Moses. And look at how the Lord instructs Joshua to know the word and to follow it and to never let it depart from his mouth, but to always be speaking it to his people. So there's a good conversation to talk about the role that Moses plays and the role that Joshua plays as leadership changes. Another good theme to talk about is battling by faith. I'm pretty sure nobody outside of Israel would ever use Joshua's battle plans as plans for themselves. I've never seen another commander in the history of warfare command his people to march around a city for 7 days, and then on the seventh day, march 7 times and blow the trumpets and expect the walls to fall down. I've never seen a general leading his army out into battle and stopping and asking that the sun would stand still so that they would be able to finish their work. No, I'm pretty sure what we find instead is we find a battle by faith. God taught Joshua how to fight righteously, how to demonstrate his trust in God even as he went out into battle. You see, Joshua's trust was not to be in horses, in weapons, in numbers of soldiers. God's trust was in one source, God himself. Think about how that applies to our work in ministry. You know, there are things we can say that would attract lots of people to our churches. So we could preach that God will give you great riches and many blessings if you just follow him, that life is easy and all blessing if you just follow Christ. Well, that's not what the scripture teaches. But we could say that, and that could be the emphasis of our ministry and draw many people in. That could be our weapon in the battle that we fight. We also know there are other things that we could do that make sense to mankind. They're smart and they're savvy, but they're not spiritual. Remember, Paul said his goal was to minister as a demonstration of the power of the Spirit. That's our goal. Why did God have Joshua do some of the unique practices in their battles? It was to teach Joshua and the children of Israel that they fought a spiritual battle. And if they're going to fight a spiritual battle, they need to fight it with spiritual weapons. And they needed to fight it by trusting God, the ultimate power in this spiritual realm. So talk about what it means to battle by faith in your ministries today. I'll give you one more. Notice as you go through the book of Joshua, how many times they do things to remember God by. Perhaps the most famous one is when they cross the Jordan River. A representative from each of the 12 tribes carries a large stone out of the river, and once they've crossed the river, they build a monument next to the Jordan River. And God says the reason you build this monument is so when your children come by and ask you, what is this monument of these 12 stones? What does it mean? Then you tell them the story about God, how delivered you from Egypt, and about how God allowed you to cross the Jordan River on dry land. The nation of Israel was commanded to remember God, not just in monuments, but in the remembering of the Passover, in the celebrating of the Day of Atonement, in the celebrating of the festival of the first fruits. God wove into their religious life ways to remember the greatness and the grace of God. So as you gather in your groups, I'd like you to think about, what do you do in your ministry? What practices have you established to help your people to remember the greatness and the grace of God? How do you help people tell their own stories of God's work in their lives? And how do you tell the story of your church so that people remember God's goodness? And as a whole, how do you tell the story of Uganda so that people remember the goodness of God? So there's three themes, three discussion opportunities for you. I hope as you gather in your groups that you have a great time of fellowship, an amazing time of worship, and you're able to discuss the word from the book of Joshua, and that your lives and your ministries will be blessed. Until I can see you again, we love you, long to see you face to face, pray for you often, and we look forward to hearing God's blessing in your lives and in your ministries.